Our next speaker is Tamara St. John. She's a tribal archivist at the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation, which is located in northeastern part of South Dakota and a small portion of the southeastern corner of North Dakota. An enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, St. John is an accomplished Native American genealogist. While studying the many Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota families, she began an in-depth research in the history of the Oceti-Sakowin, or Seven Council Fires, which makes up the 7 bands of Sioux of the Tatanka Oyate. She worked with the Minnesota Historical Society and the Dakota tribes to collaborate on commemorating controversy, the Dakota War of 1862 exhibition. She participated in panel discussions on the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862 and made numerous presentations on genealogy for the Dakota and other Native American peoples. The title of her talk today will be Reconnecting Generations Through Oral History and Genealogy. Please help me welcome Tamara St. John.
Good afternoon. It is really a pleasure to be here. And Gwen, what a wonderful presentation. Always kind of a hard act to follow. Again, my name is Tamara St. John, and I am from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, which means tribe, from the northeastern part of South Dakota and into North Dakota. And I am Dakotawi Himacha. I am a Dakota woman. And the Lake Traverse Reservation was established in 1867. And as an archivist for my tribe, I found myself working primarily with Dakota people in connecting them to this story, the 1862 history. And one of the mission statements of my office, I work under a tribal historic preservation office, and we are the people that work with the protection of sacred sites and history in general. And like a lot of THPO offices, all of us wear many hats. And in connecting them, one of the ways that we do, just as Gwen had mentioned, telling our own stories, we tell our stories through individual people. In the books, when you read the history books, a lot of times you read things that say the savage Sioux or the hostile Sioux of Minnesota, or in the so-called battles, we find mention of the Minnesota Sioux. And one of the questions that have been put to us at times in the telling of this is, do you even know who's there? It's not just Sioux, that these are people instead of a military history, because as 1862 correlates with the Civil War, we often find that the history that's sought by our tribe and by my office is related to the battles, the military history. And I do attend and do presentations, and one of the things that I say is that I am not a military historian, I'm a family historian. So often our story is not one of military. It is about women and children and families and the identity. We reconnect the identity to these events. So the parts that are often missing are those things. Who was there? And how does that impact us today? Many times I have people that come to my office with a story, maybe very sketchy and limited, and telling me that my grandmother said that we were from Minnesota. And a lot of our young people don't even realize that. After so many years from the establishment of our reservation, 1867, they know themselves to be Sisseton Wahpeton of the Lake Traverse Reservation, or they know themselves to be Crow Creek Sioux Tribe or Spirit Lake Sioux Tribe. And often the identity of us as one nation of Dakota is lost in those younger generations. That understanding needs to be reconnected, especially with our young people. I remind them on a regular basis that we are not the places in which they find us now. As we are federally recognized in these locations, such as Crow Creek or Flandreau or Spirit Lake or even Fort Peck, after the Removal Act of 1863, February 3rd, 1863, after the events of 1862, after the hangings in Mankato, the Dakota were dispersed, and we are now broken into many, many locations. We have those relatives that had gone to the northern territories of Canada. The Dakota had a vast, vast territory for many, many years into what is known as Canada now, and into the western part of the Dakotas, into Iowa, and also Wisconsin, as well as Minnesota. So for those that went to those regions, we have relatives that are very far as Montana, Fort Peck, and into Nebraska, Santee, Nebraska, and other places. And what I find as a genealogist is that our families in this era of 1862 were terribly disconnected. Our kinship ties were broken in a most horrible manner. To have siblings on one reservation with a sibling on another, and now we don't even realize how closely we're related. And in fact, my own grandfather used to say that about people that I later realized were actually second cousins, that I don't even know if they know that they're related to us here or that they come from us here. And those sort of understandings, I think, lead to some of the amount of disjointment that we have as a tribe. And it's often very difficult to come to a consensus when really we are one nation, Dakota, as well as connecting to our relatives, the Lakota and the Nakota people. So through genealogy, I have found some amazing things, and I often say that after so many years of working with genealogy and connecting people, that I feel as though I carry many, many people with me. And when we sit down and we start to explore a family, I often ask that we start with prayer and that we make a commitment to anything that we are allowed to see or to know in this person's lifetime, that we hold no judgment on this time. As my grandfather told me, no matter how many documents you read, no matter how many books you might find, you'll never know their full story. You'll never know everything that they went through or what led them to the decisions that they made back in that time period. In 1862, a lot of the decisions that were made were truly based on one thing alone, and that was survival. So as we connect back with families, and I'll give you one example of a young woman that came to me. And she told me that her grandmother for many years had said that they were from Minnesota and were from a place called Makato, meaning blue earth. And she said that she lived in a community now, a tribal community on the Standing Rock Reservation called Cannonball, and that it was very difficult there and that her people struggled. And she often didn't feel proud of them and didn't know how they became this way. How did we come from such a beautiful life, as my grandmother had described, to what I find here today? And so her answer was to start to begin to trace her grandmother's steps and how she came to arrive in Cannonball. And some of the things she found as she went backwards through time with her grandmother were things that were very traumatic. The massacre of Whitestone Hill. Few people know about Wounded Knee. There was even a movie made about Wounded Knee, but yet very few people know about the massacre of Whitestone Hill and the lives lost there, women and children. She found Whitestone Hill, and she also found the Dakota War of 1862. So the impacts of those things are very far-reaching, and how do we connect again. One of the primary things the elders within my tribe and those that I'm connected to in other places remind me is the importance of our kinship ties. The importance of our kinship ties and our identity. And one of the reasons why I'm a huge advocate for genealogy is because it is all-encompassing. And myself, many, many years ago, when I sat down, and it all began with a picture that hung above my grandfather's head, and I asked him, "Who is this woman?" And she happened to be his grandmother. And as I decided to look, and we live in an age of technology where you can research on the computer, and I started to verify everything that he was telling me. And I came upon this entire story. And one of the things that I found that it required me to look at my language, and I realized how limited my understanding of my own Dakota language was, or even the limitations of my knowledge of our history. Like the young people that I mentioned, all I knew was that we were from Sisseton, Wahpeton, the Lake Traverse Reservation. I couldn't even comprehend Minnesota. So much of that information has been lost by the 1863 Removal Act, the impact of 1862. And as we move into modern day, the understanding of those things is very critical for our young people to understand. Right now on our reservation, there is a huge focus on our young people. Our young people tend to be very lost, as they are in a lot of communities. And one of the things that I've found in working with the young people, and we're very grateful to have people like Sarah Weston, who will be speaking soon, in working with young people and inspiring them, and how she's inspiring them, like others, to examine their history and to know who their relatives are, to know who you are, and to place them in an environment that nurtures their cultural identity, makes them proud of who they are. And when you live in a world that's full of stereotypes, everything that you see, and cowboys and Indians, and I had to laugh that on our way over here in the cab ride, we even had the cab driver mention to us things like Rain Dance and the old Western movies, and these are the things that people understand of us. They really don't understand the true beauty of who we are, or who our people were, even back into the 1800s and before 1862. When people ask me if there's something, one thing that I would like people to walk away from in presentations like this related to the Dakota War, one of the things that I would stress, and we touched on that a little bit, about why did this happen? Because ultimately, the storybooks start with, all of a sudden, the Sioux became savage. They became savage and hostile in the state of Minnesota and killed many settlers. Well, why was that happening? And when you look at why that was happening, you start to connect into the terrible traditional ecological knowledge impacts that happened to our people. The way of life that we had in Minnesota, one where we sustained ourselves for many, many years through hunting or agriculture, gathering, all of the ways that we took care of ourselves and our children and our communities, all of those things were shattered. And to be reduced by treaties, as Gwen mentioned, the treaties that reduced our reservations from the vast territory that I mentioned down to a small strip of land alongside the river. And to put all of these people into one area where you were no longer able to hunt, no longer able to take care of yourselves in the way that you had originally, and the starvation. Once we connect these histories and start to look at the facts as to what was happening at the time, the level of starvation is very, very critical. I once read in another writing, and at that time it was about Y2K and what would happen if the world ended, and right away I thought about the Dakota people, because it said that faced with starvation, any group of people would ultimately come to violence. And truly with us, the level of starvation that was happening, where babies were dying and people were struggling, eating the soft parts of the marshy grasses in effort to try to survive. Those are very real events. The sort of stories that seem to come out, I've actually had people within my own office caution me and tell me that, those are really hard stories, Tamara. Maybe you need to, sort of keep it down a little bit, take it down a notch. And one of the things that I find is that if we can't acknowledge what happened to us, then how do we expect anybody else to? The truth in that story is a harsh one at times. And from that and the hostile Sioux of Minnesota, once you understand what was happening at the time and to see, what began to happen in 1862. Another really important point that comes out in genealogy is that there are many, many roles in this story. There are not one whole body of Dakota that are hostile or savage Sioux at the time. There are many different actors in this. There are those that were a part of the farmer bands. There are those that became scouts and worked with the U.S. government to help to suppress the violence of the times. There were those that fought. There were those that were hung in Mankato, and there are those that were imprisoned in Davenport, or the women and children that had literally no involvement, and are kept in Fort Snelling, and then later taken to a very remote and destitute area in Crow Creek. And when I found that when I did my own genealogy for my own family, I found that I was really descendant from all of these people. I had on each side of my family tree somebody that had been on very different sides in this story. And for those that, for example, the one of 1862 and the hanging in Mankato, we have a grandmother that she would actually be my father's grandmother. And they say in my family, the oral history is that she would cry every Christmas. If you've looked at the story, you know that Mankato, the hanging in Mankato, happened in that time. And for our family, it was a very difficult memory. So what Christmas meant to them was that her father had been hung, and her father had gone to save a relative, another male relative, likely her brother or his brother, something of that sort, and that they had kept grandfather too, and they hung him as well. So the oral histories on that side of those that were hung, and then I also am descendant of a man by the name of Thomas A. Robertson, who was a well-known scout. And as a scout, he was what is called in many of the history books mixed blood Dakota. He was of Scottish ancestry and blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and he was somebody that was really a part of both stories. And many times later on in testimony in the U.S. Court of Claims, it states that he could have been killed on either side. And I can't imagine how many people really that was their experience as well, that he could have been killed on the side of those on the native camp, as well as those on the soldier side for being somebody that identified in either direction. And that really is the story for, I think, a lot of people. Another part that tells the story, and just to give you an idea of how complex this story is, there is a great deal of additional research to be done to put together this entire story. And one of the stories is the orphans of 1862. The orphans, the settlers. And in one story, I found her story to be very telling. She says that the Indian woman that used to bake bread with my mother would not look me in the eyes. She was being held in the camp where they held the prisoners before the soldiers came and released them. the camp that held all of the settler prisoners. And so she's telling in her story that her family had relationships with the native people around them, good relationships. And if you can imagine today, for everything to be entire chaos, your world as you know it would have been turned upside down. She later goes on to talk about when she was kept in the teepee of a woman, a native woman. They took very good care of her, and when they fed her, they gave her what is a soup. And she had said, "Mini skuya," she said, and asking for salt, which told me that she knew language. Or later on, she saw a man that had what she said was white man's clothing. And right away, she thought of her father. And so she started to say, mie tipi, asking him she wanted to go home. And he picked her up and cried with her. So there was literally chaos in many, many directions. And so I think it's a it falls way short in telling the story as the hostile Sioux of Minnesota. There was an awful lot going on there, more than just that basic story. One of the things that I'd like to mention is that we have we don't have written records that go extremely far back like some tribal nations do, but our stories are found in many different areas, often in the land, the cultural landscapes, that connection to those lands. As a removed tribe, we're very disconnected from the places where we prayed, where we buried our loved ones, or the places that we gathered, where we gathered annually. In some of the journals, I've found wordage that says a favorite haunt of the Sioux, an annual hunting ground. So often the places that you see and are sometimes noted as important now are entirely something different to us. And by not connecting to our communities and getting those stories, you often miss a whole heck of a lot. The other story is found in the artifacts, and I would encourage everybody in looking at the artifacts and the things, and I'm getting into an area that Ben specializes in, there are stories associated with these things. In a recent trip a couple of years ago, I had come to the Smithsonian to look at items that came from the massacre site at Whitestone Hill. And one of the items that I found, there were about 11 items, and I found things like a rattle, which later on some of the elders told me. I had believed that it was a rattle for prayer or ceremony, and later on an elder told me, well, how do you know that? Maybe it was a child's toy. And to think that it was picked up off the bloody massacre field that day, I thought was infinitely terrible. And to go on and find a pipe bag or a pipe, I began to realize that these items were not items of war. They were domestic items. They were items that belonged to a family and a household. And probably the most telling of those artifacts was a wooden-handled spoon, a turtle-handled spoon. And if I didn't know the story of Whitestone Hill and the massacre that had occurred there, I would have looked at the spoon and thought, what beautiful craftsmanship. Isn't that amazing, the carving of the turtle? How incredible. But yet, now that I know the story of where it came from, the story associated with it becomes that it belonged to a woman that was there. A woman like myself that probably fed her family with such an item. It was probably a very valued and prized possession. The other artifacts that I found were those of the cooking pots that were holes poked into the bottom. And the story associated with that was within the so-called battles, the scorched earth type tactic, where they burned all of the teepees and food, and in the wording exactly is an effort to leave them destitute for winter. So such a terrible, terrible story. Often my mind runs ahead to that this is really our story is one of survival because we're still here. We're here and we are telling these stories. Our young people, like the ones that have worked with Sarah Weston this past year, are very inspiring in the telling of these stories as well, and the creating of their own stories. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamara.